Welcome to The Landscape, George Smith Partners podcast.
Hello and welcome to The Landscape. This is George Smith Partners' wonderful podcast. As always, I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, FinFacts. It's available at gspartners.com/FinFacts. Today, we have a very special guest, Mr. Doug Stevens. Doug is one of the world's leading futurists and the founder of Retail Profit. He's been a strategy consultant to some major brands, and I'm interested to hear about some of that on the call today. He's got a couple of decades of experience in retail leadership before he founded Retail Profit. Doug is a best-selling author of at least 3 books, and I think he's working on another one that maybe you can tell us a little bit about today. He was an early predictor of the rise of e-commerce and the transformation that it would have on moving stores into experiential hubs. He's talked about the convergence of retail and technology. He's also a widely syndicated columnist and keynote speaker, and his work bridges the future of consumer behavior, technology, and retail's role in the environment. And he has also got some interesting thoughts on sort of where society is headed. So really excited to have Doug here on the podcast today. I'm going to let Doug kind of give a little bit of background and fill in the blanks where I missed here before we get into the meat of it. So Doug, welcome on.
Yeah, thanks very much, Evan, and I appreciate you having me on. My story is essentially I've been in the industry or adjacent to the industry now for about 30 plus years. I started my career in the retail industry, actually working for a small family business that sold goods in the home improvement market. And through a series of acquisitions and mergers, found myself at a certain point working for a large petrochemical company based in the UK. And I think that's really where my kind of formal business education really began. From there, I wound up moving to the US and living in the US for about 6 years, managing a division of stores for a major US retailer. And then around 2008, my family and I decided to move back to Canada because, like many of us, we were sort of picking up some ground tremors at the time, and I felt that it would probably be a good time to relocate to the Canadian market. And it was at that time that I looked at what was happening in the landscape. And I'm sure, many of your listeners will appreciate that 2008, 2009 timeframe was just massive change going on. You could literally feel the tectonic plates shifting in the economy. The technological landscape was blowing up. The media landscape was really transforming with the advent of social media. And there was a tremendous amount of social change going on as well. And all of that, it seemed to me, wasn't really being productively narrated for the industry. I really felt there was a need in the industry, having spent enough time in it to know there was a need for someone who was looking out on a longer time horizon and really trying to synthesize the changes that were happening and bring those back to the industry in a contextual way, in a way that if I'm an executive with a retailing company, where I could understand the story and I could embrace that and incorporate it into my strategic thinking. And so it was kind of out of that realization that Retail Profit was born. And for the last almost 20 years now, Retail Profit has been working with major clients around the globe. We work with companies like BMW, L'Oreal, Walmart, and others. But we also work with trade associations like the ICSC, which I think sort of prompted our get-together today. And always focusing on that sort of 5 to 10 year horizon. I think, hey, listen, I respect futurists that look 50 years into the future, but what do we do with that, right? What do we do with that as business people? So the 5 to 10 year horizon, I think, does a couple of things. I think it's actionable. I think it's something that you can definitely take into the boardroom and discuss in a meaningful way. But it also holds me accountable. I get to live long enough to see my own errors and my own mistakes. So yeah, that's Retail Profit. I've written 3 books, as you said, on the future of retail. Some of those have been translated into multiple languages, and I'm currently working on a 4th title that is due out in June of 2026.
I'm very interested to hear a little bit more about what you're thinking about. Maybe we can catch a little bit of that during the conversation here today.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just spin back though, looking back to 2013 when you were, I think that was the first book you wrote, right? The Retail Revival.
That's right.
Um, so it's tough to predict the future, right? So how well do you think you did? I mean, you made a bunch of predictions in that book, I think, that have become reality and are becoming reality. So curious to know like which trends accelerated faster than you anticipated and what's taken a little bit longer. And maybe you can explain why.
Sure. I think the common misconception about futurism is that it's sort of a game of educated guesses. I don't really look at it that way. I think to really be effective as a futurist, you need to have a pretty strong understanding of history. And history was frankly, one of the very few things in school that I found interesting and intriguing, because it's largely about storytelling. And that's sort of what I gravitate towards. So futurism is really about pattern recognition. It's about looking across the span of time to try and find patterns that you can sort of build a projection around. You can begin to extrapolate from those patterns and be able to sort of see into the not so distant future as to what may occur, what the probability suggests might occur. The retail revival in 2013 was basically just positing the idea that we were coming to the end of an era in retail. We were coming to the end of an era where we had this massive boom in population, where we had this largely dependable middle class consumer whose income and lifestyle and livelihood was improving each year, where the constraints and the boundaries of retail, being the physical built environment, were very dependable, right? We knew that if we built a nice looking shopping center with the right tenant mix, that we would drive consumers to those centers. It was basically just laying out that we were moving into something that would look entirely different, and that businesses needed to prepare, certainly, for the impact that technology was going to have on the market. Now, you have to appreciate at that time, people were still saying, yeah, okay, sure, Amazon is growing their revenue, but they don't make any money, right? And retailers were still sort of dismissing Amazon as this profitless nuisance in the marketplace, and, weren't paying much attention to it. Businesses like Walmart, for example, were still investing heavily in supercenters and toying with the idea of being online, not really taking it seriously at all. In fact, it was on the heels of that book being released that I was called down to Bentonville to give 2 presentations to Walmart's global leadership on this whole notion of them not being Amazon, when I believe they should have been Amazon. They should have been the first to the trough in terms of internet sales. And it was on the heels of that I think the company began to look at this seriously. And Doug McMillon, by that point, was on board and began to spend tremendously on building out their online capabilities, among other things. So yeah, that book was really just about this very, very shifting landscape. My second book in 2017, which was called Reengineering Retail, really then dug deeply into the technologies that were fundamentally changing consumer experiences, everything from virtual reality to QR codes to mobile technology, all the way through to things like 3D printing, and other technologies. But it basically put forward the idea that we weren't seeing physical stores die. We weren't seeing the internet obliterate all retail. What we were seeing was that media, really in any form, whether it was by smartphone or any other form of media, was becoming the store. It was doing now the things that stores traditionally did, namely merchandise products, provide product information, and transact sales, right? So if media was becoming the store, the question I ask in the book is then what's the purpose of a physical store? And my belief was that physical stores were becoming a media channel for brands, a very measurable, manageable, and effective media channel. But we had to start looking at the experience as being the product that was being sold in those stores. So to your question, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? I think largely we can agree that, those changes manifested. I think what has perhaps frustrated me more than surprised me is the degree to which retailers remain very conventional and traditional in their thinking that it is about the product sale. The store is not a brand builder as much as it is a product distributor. And I think that's I think it's short-sighted on the part of retailers. Some get it, but I would say largely the industry has yet to fully embrace that thinking.
Right. So obviously, COVID accelerated a bunch of trends in both directions, and now we're sitting on a huge trend accelerator potentially, or disruptor with AI. And I think you've been doing some speaking recently on AI's potential to reshape retail, but also kind of a little bit of realism, maybe around the hype versus reality matrix. So not to like dive on this one, but what do you think about that? Like, where do you see AI transforming how landlords and developers, that's our clients, right? Really, the developers and owners of commercial real estate are our clients. So talk about how that might change how they think about their evaluation of the retail tenants and maybe how they manage their assets.
Sure. Yeah, just sort of panning out to the macro where we find ourselves right now with AI. We're hearing a lot about the AI bubble, and I believe that we are sitting on an AI bubble. What will be the pin that pricks the bubble? That's anybody's guess. I'm not sure what that's going to be. That could be, one bad quarterly result out of Nvidia or some other company. Who knows? But I do think there's a lot of irrational investment right now. There's a lot of leverage in the AI environment, and to Michael Burry's point. Michael Burry, who was made famous by The Big Short, shorting the housing market, there is some funky accounting going on. Let's just put it that way, in terms of how they're marking down assets and accounting for depreciation of chips and that sort of stuff. So suffice it to say, yeah, I think there's a bubble. How big a bubble it is or isn't, who knows? But what I will say is, I think we're sort of, if we're just guessing at, is there an AI bubble? I think we're talking about the wrong thing. There probably is, and bubbles are natural, right? We see it all the time. We saw one with the metaverse during the pandemic. There was this huge metaverse bubble. It exploded. Facebook or Meta's value declined sharply. But, in the aftermath, there are still some companies that are, working on metaverse technologies. I think the real question is, have we ever seen a bubble that involved trillion-dollar valuations? Number one, which is kind of new territory. Have we ever seen bubbles that involve the level of leverage that we're seeing? I mean, OpenAI is a company that loses billions of dollars, and they're talking about spending $1.4 trillion, right? So we're into some very, very different territory. How deep and connected that bubble becomes, the knock-on effect on the banking system is anyone's guess. But suffice it to say, we're in a bubble. In terms of the effect of AI, generally speaking, and I think this is the important thing, because there's an AI bubble, it doesn't diminish the impact that AI could potentially have on not just the market, but on society in general. And the thing that I'm really watching closely, above and beyond generative AI, although generative AI, I think we could argue, is already having some impact on the job market, particularly among new college graduates. We're seeing unemployment levels rise in that category. But I think that the real thing is agentic AI. This is where you now have not just a large language model that becomes sort of the generative brain of AI, but you also have agents that are given a level of reasoning, given a level of decision-making boundaries, and also work against very defined goals, and oftentimes with permissions to take action. So to your point, how would an agentic workflow work in the shopping center industry? Well, if you just look at something like facility maintenance, you could potentially have, instead of, facility manager and all kinds of people working underneath them, you could potentially have an agentic workflow that is monitoring every single system in the center in real time, evaluating the potential for risk of breakdown of those systems, taking it upon themselves through defined permissions to actually take action to maintain those systems, signing contracts, paying out invoices. All of that work that is currently being done by human beings, essentially being done by a series of AI agents who are working within very defined goals and permissions. And you could apply that now across accounts receivable, accounts payable, human resources, real estate negotiations. In fact, Walmart today is actually using AI agents to negotiate services for many of their stores, things like janitorial services. It's not being negotiated by a human being anymore. It's being negotiated by an AI with those vendors. So it could change the complexion of business dramatically, just the advent of agentic AI workflows.
All right. So, inflation is sort of stabilizing, but household debt seems to be climbing. Our listeners, again, a lot of retail investors and owners of shopping centers, et cetera, how should they look at interpreting sort of these consumer patterns? And where do you think we are with respect to like AI's impact on commercial real estate assets, particularly retail anchored assets? I think you've talked a lot about different models in terms of leases, et cetera, and sort of do you have any thoughts on that today, or maybe anything adjacent to that?
Okay, there's a lot in there. So I'll try and take them one at a time. So where's the consumer at? There are a couple of figures that I think are important. Apple just came out with a $229 tube sock that you put your phone in, right? I don't know if you've
Sure.
seen this, but
I
have
didn't
you
see
seen
that,
that?
but it doesn't shock me at all. So
Yeah, it's basically, just picture a really long tube sock that you tie over your shoulder, and it's got a cut in it, and you put your smartphone in it. It's $229. They're sold out. They are sold out, which is just mystifies me. On the other hand, McDonald's just had their quarterly shareholder meeting, and they announced that low-income consumers can no longer afford McDonald's. They're losing the low-income consumer. In 2024, the U.S. minted 1,000 new millionaires per day, right? So a lot more people becoming millionaires. However, 59% of Americans can't afford a surprise $1,000 expense. So we are in a K-shaped economy right now, right? We are
Sure.
seeing low and middle income consumers are steadily losing ground. Inflation is vastly outpacing wage gains. At the top end of the spectrum, by my numbers, about 73% of all wealth is now being held by the top 10% of U.S. society. AI is only going to make that worse. AI is not going to make that better. I know Elon Musk is doing a lot of talking about the fact that at some point work is going to become optional. Unfortunately, I don't think eating is going to become optional. So I think we're still going to have to find some means of work. But Goldman Sachs is estimating that AI could take out as many as 300 million jobs by as early as 2030. So we have to, I think, in the retail industry, understand, first of all, that the current brand of capitalism that we are going to market with is not healthy for the industry. If you're in the business of building shopping centers and you want large numbers of people to come in, and maybe you're not in the luxury mall business, you're just in the shopping center business, I would advise you get on the phone immediately. Phone your elected representative and ask them what they're doing to try and build back wages for middle class consumers and lower income consumers, because things are bound to get worse. Um, and we really have to question, like, how many luxury malls can the United States support, right? And if things don't change, we're going to see a real dropping off, I think, of the kind of the mid-tier regional mall, which has already begun. I mean, we've already seen that progression begin, but I think it's simply going to get worse as we move forward, unless something changes.
So, question for you. I mean, I don't disagree that we have this challenge where this K-shaped challenge that you're just describing, that's divergence between, wealth and inequality, wealth gap, or whatever you call it. But we do seem to have a problem with, at least in the United States, and I'm sure it's similar up there in Canada. But one thing I've observed is that my generation is many of these folks are just absolutely loaded down with student debt and other types of things, and you have this sort of um, massive incentive that's present in the economy, which is like in the US, we have a government guarantee effectively of student debt, can't wipe it out, so on and so forth. And then what you have is this kind of virtuous or this cycle where college keeps getting more expensive at a rapidly expanding pace because they have every incentive to make it more expensive because the government is guaranteeing the debt. And the loser in all of it ends up being the consumer, right?
Mhm.
With and what we have, I think I take a little bit different view on it maybe than you do. I'm not trying to get in a debate here, but I see
Debate's good.
like this as a huge issue. And I actually kind of think, the challenge with AI could be how rapidly it gets deployed and how quickly it might change, cause that disturbance that you were just describing with, these hundreds of thousands of millions of jobs that we're going to change. Right. And I agree with you. Everyone's got to eat every day. We're not going to AI eat in the future, I guess. So
Mhm.
it is what's really interesting is that, like any technological revolution, there's massive shifts, right? I think in the 1860s, still like 50% of the US workforce was agrarian, right? Farming,
Mhm.
et cetera. Now it's like 1%. So, technology finds ways for people to have different jobs and so on and so forth. But I think one of the challenges here could be the speed at which it's happening, and the economy's ability to kind of generate those new opportunities.
Yeah, I dig into that in this new book that I mentioned earlier.
Hmm.
Um, First and foremost, the idea, and it's a very common line of thinking, that technology, for every new technology that comes into the marketplace, yes, there are jobs that are lost, but there are more jobs that are created as a consequence of the technology, right? That's something that we hear a lot. That does not apply to robotics, and it is likely not going to apply at all to AI. We're not talking here about a situation where well, like in the early 70s, where you had maybe 5 people on an assembly line that were replaced by one robot, right? We're talking potentially about entire classes of employment being wiped out completely. Why would you have 50 accountants working in your accounting department when really all you need is one accounting supervisor that is going to make sure that the AI is working within its constraints, it's operating against its permissions, and you're kind of doing a gut check on the numbers that it's producing, right? So we're talking about entire classes, legal, accounting, middle management within organizations basically being decimated. So I think the numbers are going to be profound. And this is not a situation where you take somebody who's a junior accountant, you say, well, now you're going to become an AI developer, right? So we're talking about an order of magnitude greater job loss. So I think it will be something that we should be preparing for. And this is the most disturbing thing of all. It's not that this may happen, because I think it if you look at it honestly, it's kind of a natural consequence. The disturbing part is that we're not hearing conversations either at a senior business level about how are we going to manage this, right? How are we going to ensure that 20% of society doesn't just fall off the map? And we're not even hearing about it at a government level. At the government level, we're talking about taking the handcuffs off AI companies and letting them do whatever they need to do to beat the Chinese at AI. We're not talking about how are we going to support 20 to 30% unemployment in the marketplace. What does society look like when we have that kind of unemployment? That's Depression era kind of unemployment. So I think that's important. Your question around education, very similar sort of progression. In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, early 70s, we looked societally at education as an investment in prosperity. We looked at it as being a good thing for society to invest in because it generated intelligence, it gave people skills, it allowed social mobility. The poor person could become the rich entrepreneur because they received an education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Around about the 1980s and early 1990s, we took a very different view, where all of a sudden there were those who said, "Well, I don't want to pay so that someone else's kid can go to school. I'm happy to pay for my own kid's education, but I don't want to pay for anyone else's." And that's where we saw the student debt crisis begin. Banks began lobbying for the same conditions to exist on government loans as existed on private loans, being that you couldn't declare bankruptcy as a student. You had to show significant hardship in order to even be considered for being able to write off that debt. And so to your point, as you said, you now have a generation who is entering the workforce with many mortgages that they're having to pay off. They have this burden of debt that they're beginning their careers with. So, we have some really, really important societal issues that we need to reckon with, I think. We need to start having honest conversations about them because they directly impact the consumer industry, and we're seeing that play out in the K-shaped economy that you just mentioned.
So let's talk a little bit about let's shift gears out of this part of AI and talk about, you know, a little bit. Let's move back to like cities and evolution of geography and how retail might work, given, I don't know if you thought of much about this, just given what AI is going to do to our mobility and delivery of goods. I was just at not to like get too sidetracked, but an example is I was just at a conference and I had no idea how far along some of these drone delivery companies are getting, how many miles of, they've flown without incident, and just like the massive amount of disinflationary pressure that puts on costs, et cetera, but also at the same time, how disruptive it could be to certain retail things. Um, have you thought about that at all, and what that means to like the impact of the retail economy and the consumer?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been tracking the drone delivery phenomenon for at least the last 10 to 12 years now, from the time that Amazon and frankly DHL, because DHL was flying drone deliveries before Amazon was. They were playing around with it. So yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that life is going to become more convenient. I think that the power of AI is going to manifest itself in many, many different aspects of our lives, from conveniences like, really, really rapid delivery, not to mention just the efficiency among delivery companies of really being able um, to manage their routes at a level of efficiency that has you know until now been impossible, to really be able to forecast demand in a way that up until this point has been impossible. And it's sort of not just AI, but the combination of AI and big data. When you put those
Hmm.
two things together, you can basically create a virtual scenario of what the future might look like over the next, quarter, 2 quarters, where an organization now can really begin to resource plan in a way that might have been impossible up to this point. So yeah, I think it's going to deliver, enormous levels of convenience. But it's every new tool has a blessing and a curse, right? Fire,
100%.
the advent of fire was wonderful because we could stay warm in the winter and not die in our caves. But by the same token, if you're not careful with fire, you can burn your house down, and maybe your neighbors while you're at it. So I think we have to sort of look at these things as being, the more powerful the tool is, the more powerful the good stuff it can do is, potentially the deeper the downside is. And we just have to manage for the downside.
That's right. So I agree. So let's get into some lightning round questions here. Like, what are you most excited about in the next 5 years?
What am I most excited about? It's a weird time to ask that question. You know that, Evan. I mean, this is sort of like in in the middle of a riot. I think that, I'll put it to you this way. I think society, and again, because of this book, and I hate to keep going back to this,
No, it's
but
good.
but
I mean, you're
I
thinking
think,
about it. So.
I've been thinking a lot about where we're at as a society, and really we are seeing the breaking point on so many levels, right? Trust in democracy is at all-time lows in the developed world. Trust in capitalism, just the fundamental belief that capitalism is fair, that's at an all-time low. Faith in the education system is again at an all-time low. So, in many ways, I think we really are at kind of a breaking point of all the systems that got us to where we are today. It's kind of like, if society were in a boat and we're paddling across the ocean, we are now at the point where the boat is starting to fall apart. And on the one hand, that sounds dismal and desperate. But on the other hand, I think it's an opportunity. And this is really the point I get to in the book, is that for business leaders who begin to regard those things, the breakdown of faith and trust, the breakdown of fairness, and the breakdown of education and intelligence, if you turn that around and look the other way through that prism, those things become enormous competitive advantages. If you can capitalize on the vacuum of trust that exists in society today and become an enormously trusted company. That's a huge leg up on your competition. If you can become regarded by your employees, your consumers, your communities of operation, and your vendor networks as being fair, just a company that deals fairly with people and with integrity, huge advantage. And if you as a company can step into the education void and look for opportunities where you can build a pipeline of talent, maybe by becoming, to some extent, an educational institution, as Walmart is doing right now in Bentonville. They're actually building their own STEM school in Bentonville, Arkansas. Then that too becomes a huge competitive advantage. So on the one hand, you can kind of look out the window today and you can say, oh, good Lord, everything's coming apart and we're in really rough shape as a society. I tend to look at that as being potentially an opportunity for businesses to create competitive advantage and in doing so, repair society.
Interesting. So, we need to kind of wrap it up here, but a couple of thoughts. I think there's also one thing I've observed is a bit of a messaging problem with capitalism, so to speak. Let me give you a specific example. I would posit that few companies have made Americans wealthier than Amazon has. But at the same time, Amazon has caused a lot of structural problems with our economy. They've become very large. Um, and of course, the equity holders of Amazon have probably outperformed the general consumers of Amazon, right? Because they
Right.
benefited from equity appreciation. But at the same time, think 25 years ago, how many people did you know that could touch a button and get almost any obscure item on the planet that they could possibly think of delivered to their house? Amazon puts the stuff inside of your garage. You get that thing they connect to your garage or whatever, and they'll do that in like 3 hours.
Sure.
And at worst, it's a day or two. And
Yeah.
so 25 years ago, that level of wealth was only available to the top 0.1% or 0.01%, 1 in 100,000 or whatever individuals in our country. And granted, you know, we're a very consumer driven society and so on and so forth. But I would also posit that, like, companies like Amazon have just absolutely made people much wealthier. At the same time, people don't feel like that. They feel like they're taken advantage of
Mhm.
by these companies because of their policies or whatnot. And to some extent, maybe they are. But is there a messaging problem there?
I think that there's. I mean, I look at it as a structural problem. I don't take anything away from Jeff Bezos and what he did. I mean, what Jeff Bezos did was essentially take what Sears did with catalog shopping in the 1800s, and he
Right.
digitalized it, right? And built this
Sure.
enormous online
Machine.
catalog of goods that could be shipped to your home. Sears was no less revolutionary in the 1800s when they did that. And by the way, there was as much of an outcry among independent retailers that Sears was eating their lunch and putting them out of business at the time. So what goes around comes around. I think the difference for me is that when you look at the period between 1945 and 1975, what you saw, and I mean, I could show you a chart. There are plenty of charts that show this, but during that period of time, everybody's wealth was going up. Everybody's prosperity was going up. The gains that were being had in the economy were being shared largely across all income quintiles, right? So there was this enormous feeling among society at large that life was getting better. I was able to afford things. I could get a new car. I could own two cars. I could buy a bigger home. I could have more kids, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, you look at the explosion of brands that took place between 1950 and 1975, not just in the US or Canada, but across most of Europe. It is astonishing how many massive brands, Walmart being a great example, 1962, Walmart just, hit the map and started running. So when did that change? That changed around 1980. And we start to see all of a sudden the lines start to separate. We see antitrust rules change. Corporations become enormously larger. They control more and more distribution. They begin putting downward pressure on wages. We see this separation of the asset class and the working class.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point about Amazon, yes, Amazon has made a lot of folks wealthy, but about 10% of Americans hold about 80% of all stocks. If you're generous, it might be 20%, right?
Yeah.
The other 80% own, whatever they might have in their 401k, and that's about it. So they're not really direct owners of stock. So, I think that we just have to sort of say, look, we can't invent a time machine and go back to 1945, and God forbid we do, because we were coming out of a world war. But what we can do is we can look back at that era and say, what was the essence? Well, the essence was people largely trusted in their government, in public institutions, about 73% trust in democracy. People largely felt that things were fair. If I work hard, I can get ahead, I can do better. And they felt that they could become more intelligent. They could get an affordable education and change their lot in life. We need to capture the essence of that as business leaders, and we need to begin promoting that, not just through our actions, but also through our political activity or political contributions. And we need to install politicians who believe that we need to get back to that era of mass prosperity. If we do that, I guarantee you.
So not to cut you off, but give me like the top 2 or 3 policies that you think generated some of that. Like what specifically are we talking about? Because if you keep trying to like raise wages or whatnot, it puts pressure. So there's got to be a couple of policies that really generated that sort of activity that you're going for. I mean, I gave you an example or two of things that I think are specific policies I think are negatively impacting people. Like, for example, particularly student loan debt. The government has guaranteed this. Now, the outcome of it is it's very obvious. Like the largest colleges are using the weakest graduates to fund their sports program, basically. I mean, there's this massive thing. And what's happened is that like the administrative class of colleges has exploded at a time when, like if you look at the statistics of the number of administrators per student, it should be going down with technology, right? It's exploded because you have this perverse incentive. And that perverse incentive ends up the bag holders are working at Starbucks and on their 4-year degree. So, like give me like a couple of specific tweaks that you would make if you had a magic wand.
Sure. So let's just talk about the thing you just mentioned. The skyrocketing tuitions that are happening at colleges and universities. That started to happen around the late 1980s. What happened was colleges began to compete for out-of-state students because out-of-state students and foreign students paid higher tuition fees, right? It makes sense. So how did they begin competing? They didn't begin competing because they said our grade point averages are higher, our graduate placements are higher. They began competing on the basis of facilities, right? We have the best
can provide
dorms,
you the most fun,
5-star dorms, the best restaurants on campus, that sort of thing. And so what did they need? They needed massive marketing departments that could market the school to try and attract those tuitions. So a lot of what we see in terms of rising tuitions is not because instructors are being paid more. In fact, we have more adjunct professors now at universities than we ever have, right?
Yeah.
So it's because we're paying for all these fringe benefits. So that's that. I also think that the meddling that the banking lobby did in terms of federal student loans has also contributed to the problem. Because if you are a student and you are experiencing tremendous hardship, but you can't even declare bankruptcy, meanwhile, the corporation
Right.
down the street can walk away from $1 billion loan and go back into business the next day,
Exactly. It's very
that's a
perverse
problem,
incentive.
right? So
Totally.
what would I do to change things? I'll give you one, because I know we're probably tight on time, but I'll give you
It's
one.
all right. It's all right. This is a great conversation.
I think that one of the problems that we see manifest across the entire economy today, whether we're talking about stagnant wages, whether we're talking about inflation, is monopoly and oligopoly power. About 80% of all groceries that get sold in the United States are sold by 3 companies.
That's
And that's the
crazy.
same in Canada, about 80%.
Unbelievable.
If we look at the telecom market, same thing, right? We look at Google has a 90% share of search, right? The list goes on and on and on. And that's a change that took place. Again, antitrust rules used to be, prior to 1980, antitrust rules were based on, will this merger or acquisition, will it kill competition? Will it reduce competition in the marketplace? And if there was even a 30% reduction in competition, it wouldn't make it past antitrust. That changed in and around the 1980s when all of a sudden it was determined that no, we'll change that regulation on the basis of efficiency. If a company comes to us and says, no, if we buy this other company, we will be able to give consumers lower prices, that was all they needed to do. They didn't even need to prove it. They just needed to say it with confidence. Here's the kicker. In most acquisitions and mergers, prices do not go down. They go up by an average of 17%. Competition gets annihilated. Vendors to those companies wind up having their prices controlled now. So that there's sort of monopsony pricing on vendors in terms of product vendors, service vendors. When you only have one customer in a market, you pay what the customer wants, or you charge what the customer wants you to charge. Wages suffer under monopolies because if there's only 3 companies in the market, in the grocery market, right? Employees are going to have to pay or be paid what those grocery retailers are going to pay. So if I could change one thing, I would go back in time and I would say that if you want to merge with another company or acquire another company, and it is going to be detrimental to competition in the marketplace in any significant way, that merger or acquisition wouldn't happen, because competition is good for everybody. It's good for consumers. It drives prices down, it drives wages up, and it keeps the economy healthy. And, you get a situation where if somebody has a great idea out in California and they want to start a grocery store, they can, because the barriers to entry and the gates to entry are not being shut by 3 companies.
So said differently, there's this concept of regulatory capture, right? And you can see this in all kinds of parts of the world, and not to pick on one part in particular, but like look at the look at trying to think of a really good example. I really can't, but okay. So what's happened though is that the barrier to entry keeps getting harder and farther and more difficult, right? Because what happens is the largest companies advocate for all these additional restrictions and rules and regulations that limit competition. They basically pull up the ladder behind them, right? So now if you want to go start an airline company, there you go, like to build a jet in America, to compete with Boeing and Airbus. I mean, forget it.
Right.
Because you not only you have a huge capital problem just with the physical plant and building an airplane, but you got to comply with so many regulations and processes and whatnot. Forget it. You'll never make it. Right. So I would also argue that there's this regulatory capture concept that is very similar, because what happens is when the companies get very large, they can comply with everything. They have departments of lawyers and everything to figure it out.
Well, they can comply
So,
with everything and they can lobby against everything too, right?
right.
And I mean,
Hmm.
you look at the tech lobby right now, it used to be that the oil and gas lobby was the largest lobbying group in Washington. That's not true anymore. It's the tech lobby. Billions upon billions of dollars were spent by tech companies and AI companies to convince lawmakers that they should not put any restrictions whatsoever on AI companies in terms of legal boundaries, right? They should be allowed to do whatever the hell they want to do. And that creates an unfair playing advantage immediately out of the gate, right? That the ability to lobby to change the laws, not so that the law gets better and more fair for everybody, but so that the law gets manipulated for your sector or your
Hmm.
business because
Interesting.
you have deep enough pockets to do it. That creates an unfair playing field. So I think what we should be promoting, what we should be working back to, if we want to look at it more broadly, let's forget about just the antitrust thing. But I think really what we should be looking to try and create is a more fair playing field for everyone, right? For consumers, for workers, for corporations, broadly speaking, and one that promotes competition,
Hmm.
growth, innovation. And monopolies don't create innovation. They don't promote
Sure.
innovation, just the
Yeah.
opposite.
All right. So, Doug, thank you so much for joining us today. I thought that was a great discussion. You have an interesting view on the world, and you've been thinking about this a lot. You have a new book coming out next year, like you mentioned. So we'll be on the lookout for that. Do you want to say anything about that, or?
It's going to be coming out in June of 2026. I don't want to reveal the title just yet, but it's going to cover everything that we just talked about, Evan, and more.
Great. And then if people want to learn more about you, where do they find you?
Just go to retailprofit.com. That's the mothership.
Great. Well, thanks for coming today. And for our listeners, don't forget to subscribe to FinFacts. The George Smith Partners newsletter comes out every week. And Doug, thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.